In this video, I'm going to go over the stories in the second Thieves World volume, which was called Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn. If you remember the introduction from Thieves World, you probably remember that Hakim the storyteller was telling some children a story which basically encompassed the history of Sanctuary and how it was created. Then he was interrupted by one of the new Prince Governor's hellhounds. In the introduction to Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn, Hakim is back. But this time, he's just kind of sitting around the Vulgar Unicorn, kind of waiting to hear some stories, hoping to pick up some juicy tidbits so that he can continue telling his stories for money out in the bazaar. Another thing he's doing is wondering what happened to One Thumb, who used to be the bartender at the Vulgar Unicorn. If you read the first anthology, Thieves World, then you probably read Blood Brothers, so you have an idea what has happened to One Thumb. The other thing Hakim is doing is basically kind of going over some thoughts about the current state of Sanctuary and just wondering where it's all going to lead. There's really not much of a story here, so I would rate this a 4 out of 10. The second story is by Philip Jose Farmer, who's probably best known for his Riverworld series, which was 5 novels published back in the 70s and I think early 80s. His story for this anthology is called Spiders of the Purple Mage. The story's main character is a dentist and midwife named Masha Zillanil, and one night she's returning home from helping someone give birth when she sees a friend of hers that is injured. When she goes to help the guy, he tells her about a jewel that he's got, and this rat that had been nearby ran off with it when the guy fell down. She goes to help him try to find it and realizes that he's being pursued by some people. Later, when she's at home, she's telling the story about her friend to her mother, and her drunkard husband overhears what she's saying. Thanks to his loud mouth, the story kind of gets spread around Sanctuary. This causes some problems for Masha, and it ends up leading to her being attacked. But when she gets attacked, someone helps her, and then there's this whole exchange where this person that helped her kind of knows who she is and has heard all the rumors, and he needs her help to try to get into the same place that her friend in the beginning of the story had gotten into. The story is okay, but I see some issues with it. It's broken up into 14 chapters, and half of the story is basically set up until they get to the Purple Mage's island home. It's never really explained how Masha, who is from a well-to-do family, according to the description of her, how she ended up married to a guy who's a bit of a drunken lout. The source of her midwife and dentistry expertise is never really explained, so the character's a little bit flat from that perspective. Another thing that's kind of odd about her is that unless Sanctuary just does this to everybody, Masha is one heck of a fighter, and she really shows no remorse for any of the people that she kills during the story. And the biggest problem with the entire story is that once the guy saves her from being attacked, he kind of leads her by the nose through the rest of the story. And when they get to the Purple Mage's island, he basically just needs her because he thinks that the Purple Mage's defenses all key on men and that it would take a woman to get into the place. So he's essentially just taking her along because of her genitals. So it's kind of weird. She's a really strong character, so I'm not sure I like the fact that she only seemed to be there because she was a woman. I think Farmer might have been trying to make a strong female character, but it came across like she was only there because she was a female and for no other reason. Because of that, I would probably only give this story a 5 out of 10. On a side note, the title of the story is Spiders of the Purple Mage. If you're familiar with Western novels at all, you might have heard of a book by Zane Grey, which is called Riders of the Purple Sage. Based on the description of that book that I found online, it doesn't seem like it has anything in common with this specific story in Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn. It's not like, it doesn't seem like Farmer was trying to kind of copy the plot or maybe make a sword-and-sorcery version of that specific story. I could be wrong because I've never read it, but to my knowledge, the only real similarity here is the way the titles sound. Spiders of the Purple Mage, Riders of the Purple Sage. One last note on the story. I think Farmer gives a nod to fandom because he uses the word mofansif as an exclamation meaning mind-boggling. If you look at the spelling of it, it looks like he's saying mo, f, and sf, or more f and sf, more fantasy and science fiction. It's just an interesting little nod to fandom, I think. The next story is by Vietnam War veteran David Drake, who published a lot of science fiction and military science fiction with Baen books. I think he's most famous for his Hammer Slammer stories, which were collected a few years ago into a 3-volume set. Someday I may get to those on this channel since I have all 3 of them waiting to be read. Drake's story is called Goddess, and it starts with Lord Regley nervously pacing in a room because his wife is giving birth in the room next door. When her brother, a guy named Samlor, shows up, he goes into that room and kicks the midwife out because he's not real happy about what's going on with his sister. There's a long history that gets described in the story, so I won't go into that, but there's a reason that he's not real happy with her. By the time he leaves, Lord Regley realizes something is wrong. I don't want to say too much about that part of the story because it'll give things away. The next thing you know, Samler is kind of hanging out outside the Temple of Hecht, Heqt, and he is convinced that the priests of Hecht are partially responsible for the condition that his sister was in. The rest of the story is basically him investigating that situation and trying to figure out what really happened with it and exacting some revenge where necessary. This is a well-written story that had an excellent pace, and it started at the right moment. David Drake drops just enough information for you to understand what's going on, and his descriptions are excellent. Samler, the main character, doesn't necessarily like his sister, but he does care about family loyalty, and he does care about making people pay for abusing other people. At one point, it got kind of a dungeon crawl feel to it, but it didn't take anything away from the story, and it fit really well with everything else that was going on. I would give this story a 9 out of 10. The next story is The Fruit of Enlibar by Lynn Abbey. In this story, we get a return to Illyra, the half-Sedanzo fortune teller who actually really can see things using her cards and whatever sight she has. She starts hearing rumors about a death-pale boy with straw-colored hair that lived in town more than 15 years ago, and it makes her kind of nervous because she knows somebody like that from her past. When she was a child, something terrible happened, and this person was a part of it. The next thing you know, a guy named Wallagren shows up to her bazaar tent asking her to take a look at a piece of pottery that he's found because it may contain some information or some history that he's really interested in because of something that he's trying to find. After that, the story focuses on Wallagren, and he's basically trying to figure out what he can from the shard. There isn't too much going on in this story. There's a shared history between Wallagren and Illyra, of course, and that has some interesting effects. It also causes the author to go into some of the Sedanzo history and ways, and some of that stuff's pretty interesting to see fleshed out. The story reads like the author wasn't sure who should be the main character. Half of it's told from Illyra's point of view, half of it's told from Wallagren's point of view, but Wallagren's point of view half doesn't really add that much to the story. Some of it just seems to be there for the word count. For me, this one really wasn't that great of a story, and it only rates about a 5 out of 10. The next story is called The Dream of the Sorceress by A.E. Van Vogt. Not sure if I'm saying that name right, but he's a science fiction author from way back. The thing he's most famous for to me is a novel called Slan, S-L-A-N. Van Vogt's story, The Dream of the Sorceress, focuses on a healer named Alton Stolwig. He basically consults with people and often provides remedies that are based on the herbs and things that he grows in his greenhouse. When the women can't pay, sometimes he bargains with them for sexual favors, which, according to the story, is not a very uncommon thing in Sanctuary. Alton's past comes into play in the story because the night his father died years before, he heard his father cry out from the other room where his father normally slept, and he didn't go to investigate because of a previous arrangement that him and his father had, not to interrupt each other when they were in the middle of things. This haunts Alton's dreams a little bit, so, he's kind of trying to deal with that emotional trauma some. When Illyra comes to see him to get some herbs, she tells him that she had a dream about the god Ills, and Ills is unhappy with Alton. Alton starts obsessing over why the god would be unhappy with him, and he starts trying to figure out what's going on and what would cause the god to be unhappy with him. Characters like Jubal, One Thumb, Prince Catechithus, and Kapinvara from previous stories come into play in this one. They make brief appearances. The writing style of this story is pretty good, but the first half is a bit confusing because Van Vogt doesn't really hold your hand to explain some of the things that are going on. I kind of appreciate that because it means that he respects you as a reader and doesn't really think you need your hand held when things will become evident to you if you're paying attention. I didn't really like the idea that women would trade their bodies and give sexual favors just to get herbs, but then again, maybe I'm just putting 2025 values on stuff that happened in like a medieval type setting, and maybe it was pretty common back in medieval times. I don't know. In Sanctuary, there is a god named Vashanka who is called Vashanka Tinslayer, and he's got a sister named Azuna who is supposedly his unwilling concubine. This story actually gives an explanation on why Vashanka is called the Tinslayer and why Azuna is his unwilling concubine. Overall, I'd give this story a 6 out of 10. The one thing that really kind of brings it down for me is that I've never really cared for stories where the gods walk the earth and interact with men as if they were men themselves. The next story is Vashanka's Minion by Janet Morris. Vashanka's Minion is the first of 11 stories that Janet Morris contributed to the Thieves World anthology series. She also wrote several tie-in novels that use Tempus and other characters that she created for Sanctuary, as well as some of the settings and locations that are mentioned in some of her stories. All of Jubal's minions wear blue hawk masks at this point in the history of Sanctuary. Seems kind of stupid to me because it would just point out who all the criminals are, but this is part of what Jubal's organization does. Anyway, Tempest is the newest hellhound in town, and he is using one of Jubal's hawk masks to train his horse to kill. So he's basically just killing the guy for no good reason, with no trial. There's no evidence that the guy did anything wrong. He's just doing it to train his horse. After he kills the blue hawk mask, Vashanka speaks to him and tells him that he's supposed to be building Vashanka a temple in Sanctuary, and where is it? Tempest essentially tells his god to piss off, and Vashanka tells him, hey, go to the wharf. Once he gets to the wharf, Tempest finds out that there was a woman that washed ashore, and based on her description, he thinks he knows her. The story progresses from there with Tempest trying to find out where the woman is and that kind of thing. The story's put together pretty well. The writing's okay. Even though Vashanka is mentioned, it's not quite a Gods Walk Among Us type of story, but it is heavily influenced by an active Vashanka. Tempest is an interesting but grumpy character himself, and there's plenty more backstory where he came from, because he's supposedly 350 years old or so at the time of this story. I would rate this one a 6 out of 10. It's good, but it didn't wow me, although I am looking forward to the next story that features Tempest. The next story is called Shadowspawn by Andrew Offutt. The story starts off with a thief stalking a woman who seems to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, which doesn't really seem that hard to do in Sanctuary after dark. In the next scene, we see Tempest and Hans, who is also known as Shadowspawn, talking about recent events that they've both been involved in Sanctuary. Their conversation gets interrupted by a thief that Hans knows, and it makes Hans curious. So when the guy leaves, Hans follows him, and the story takes off from there. Shadowspawn is practically a direct sequel to Vashanka's Minion. The main difference is that Tempest is not the main character in this one. Hans, aka Shadowspawn, is the main character in this one. It makes me wonder how much talking and how much sharing of notes and rough drafts that the two authors did, Janet Morris and Andrew Offutt. Makes me wonder how much sharing they did of rough drafts while they were writing the story, so that they could make sure that they got everything kind of synced up. Shadowspawn is one of my favorite characters in Thieves World. This story adds some depth to his character, which is nice. He's not infallible because he does screw up from time to time. But one thing that was made evident in Vashanka's Minion, the previous story, is that he's not a killer. He doesn't like to kill unless it's absolutely necessary. By the same token, he's not a thief with a heart of gold either. He's kind of in things for himself, but he's not going to go out of his way to hurt anybody either. Andrew Offutt has 7 more stories throughout the rest of the Thieves World anthologies, and he's written a couple of follow-on novels that seem to feature Shadowspawn, so we'll see. There's probably a lot more development coming for this character. With all that said, I thought the writing in the story was a bit uneven. There were times where I felt like I needed to reread previous sentences or paragraphs just so that I could get the subtext of whatever was going on in the paragraph I was on at the time. So that made it a little less enjoyable, but it was still a pretty good story. I would rate this one a 6 out of 10. The last story in Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn is called To Guard the Guardians, and it was written by Robert Lynn Asprin. Based on the conversation at the beginning of the story, I'd say that the first half of it overlaps with Shadowspawn, the previous story. The last half of it definitely happens after the events of Shadowspawn. The story starts off with two of the Hellhounds, Razkuli and Zalbar, walking through the bazaar to go get some lunch, and Razkuli is complaining to Zalbar about Tempus. Tempus is essentially a loose cannon. He keeps doing things outside the law, and he basically has made himself judge, jury, and executioner for some of the criminals in the town, and Razkuli's not happy. Zalbar's not happy with Tempus because even though Zalbar outranks Tempus, Tempus has the ear of the Prince Governor, Catechethus, and because of that, Tempus just thinks he can get away with anything. When they stop to eat lunch near an estate, they hear some screams coming from another building. Zalbar jumps up to investigate, but Razkuli's already knows what's going on. He's aware of what's happening in the house, and he knows that they can't stop it. I can't say too much more about it because it would be giving too much away. This story does touch on a philosophical discussion about science. The question it asks is the future benefit of this science worth the bad stuff that you have to do to get to the point where you have the knowledge? Another question it asks is it wrong to kill known criminals without a trial, especially if the one that is doing the killing is the one that's supposed to be upholding the law in the first place? This is my favorite story in Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn. It sets up a situation that naturally leads to the topics that I just mentioned. One good thing this story did is that it didn't go overboard introducing new characters. The ending is put together pretty well, and I probably should have seen it coming, but I don't always think too critically while I'm reading through a story. I kind of like to be surprised. After reading the story, I was thinking about the action, the dialogue, and the characters, and I thought, well, you should have seen it coming because it was all right there, but like I said, I don't always examine it as closely as I should while I'm reading a story. If you're an observant reader, you'll probably see it coming. I would give this story a 9 out of 10 rating. Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn ends with an essay called The Lighter Side of Sanctuary, written by Robert Lynn Asprin. One of the things he points out is that many readers that wrote into them complained that the stories were often very, very grim. After reading Thieves World and Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn, I would have to say that I kind of agree with that assessment. There are some pretty grim stories in these books. The reason the essay is called The Lighter Side of Sanctuary is that in a tongue-in-cheek way, they were trying to address the fact that some of these stories are so grim. The premise behind it is that the Sanctuary Chamber of Commerce put out a pamphlet basically saying how great Sanctuary is. For the reader, it's a satirical look at the city with information about the real estate market, the labor market, and the availability of materials. On the lifestyle side, it covers religion, social life, nightlife, and the availability of higher social status for anyone that has even the most modest of means. After you've read these first two anthologies, Thieves World and Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn, you'll find some humor in this essay. This Sanctuary Chamber of Commerce pamphlet basically puts the best possible light on everything that there is to do with Sanctuary. And that's pretty much it for Tales from the Vulgar Unicorn. Based on the averages of all the different stories that are in this book, this one basically rates a 6 out of 10. Until next time, I hope you've enjoyed this review and it's made you curious to either read or reread them if you've read them before. And I hope you enjoy it if you do. Have a good one.